Joe Pendleton is a talented and driven quarterback for the soccer team who dreams of one day leading his team to victory in the Super Bowl. His life is centered around sports, training, and perfecting his skills. Joe is confident in his future, always taking care of his health, avoiding bad habits and strictly following a regimen. His irrepressible desire to be the best is backed by an optimism that inspires those around him. He believes he has many years ahead of him to achieve his goals. One day during a routine bicycle training session, Joe gets into an accident. At that moment, his life is suddenly cut short. But things turn out to be much more complicated than one might expect. Joe finds himself in a clear, desolate space that resembles a kind of waiting between worlds. He is met by a fidgety and somewhat confused Mr. Jordan, who explains that he has left the mortal world. However, Joe quickly realizes that something is wrong. He doesn't feel dead, he has no wounds, and he's sure he shouldn't have died. Mr. Jordan tells him that there has been a mistake. The official in charge of the soul transition rushed in and took Joe before his life was actually cut short. In fact, Joe was supposed to survive the accident, but because of the premature intervention, his body has already been buried. Joe is outraged because his plans have been ruined and his dream of victory has been left unrealized. He insists that this is unfair and demands that he be given back the chance to live. Mr. Jordan calms him down and explains that there is a way to remedy the situation. He suggests that Joe return to Earth, but in a different body, since his own is no longer available. Joe is skeptical of the idea, but agrees, realizing that this is the only chance to continue his life. They begin their search for a suitable body to match Joe's ambitions. After several failed attempts, Joe finds himself in the mansion of wealthy industrialist Leo Farnsworth, who has recently been killed in a conspiracy orchestrated by his wife Julia and her lover Tony. Leo was a man whose life was far from sporting and honorable, but his body suits Joe's purposes. Entering a new body, Joe begins to settle into an unfamiliar role. He discovers that he is now the owner of a vast fortune and corporation, but also realizes that he is at the center of a complex conspiracy. Joe decides to use his new resources to realize his dreams. He hires Max Corky, a former coach who was close to him, to train again and prepare for his return to the sport. Max doesn't realize at first who is in front of him, but after a series of proofs and references to personal moments of their friendship, he becomes convinced that the man in front of him is indeed Joe. Soon Joe meets Betty Logan, a woman who comes to Farnsworth asking him to stop his company's project that threatens her town's environmental system. At first sight, Joe becomes enamored with Betty. Her sincerity and concern for others awakens new feelings in him. Joe promises her to reconsider the project, although this arouses the suspicions of Julia and Tony, who realize that something has changed in Leo's behavior. Julia and Tony begin to weave new intrigues, planning to get rid of Leo, who has suddenly become a nuisance to them. They suspect that he has learned something about the conspiracy and try to find out how far he has progressed in his investigations. Joe, realizing the threat, decides to use his position to expose the conspirators and restore justice. Meanwhile, Joe and Betty's relationship grows closer. She notices that this Leo is different from the one she has heard about before. He is caring, attentive, and sincere in his intentions. Joe tries to maintain a balance between his feelings for Betty, preparing for his return to the sport, and dealing with his inner enemies. The climax comes when Julia and Tony make an attempt to get rid of Joe for good. They set up a new conspiracy, hoping to take him out of the game. However, Joe, thanks to his intuition and Max's support, anticipates their actions and finds a way to protect himself. He exposes their crimes, which leads to their arrest. Despite his success, Joe begins to realize that his time in Leo's body is coming to an end. Mr. Jordan reappears to inform him that Joe must leave this body, as his fate is now tied to another role. Joe accepts this with a heavy heart, but realizes that everything he has done has benefited the people around him. In the finale, Joe gets a new body, this time that of a quarterback who is preparing for the big game. He begins his journey in the sport again, but this time with new knowledge and experience. Although he loses the memories of his life as Leo, the connection with Betty remains on an intuitive level. They meet again, and despite their lack of conscious memory, their feelings find each other. The story ends on an optimistic note, emphasizing that sometimes fate gives second chances to fulfill one's destiny.